I was
Okay.
I was going to ask if that painting behind you is one of yours.
Yeah, I did this. You know the painting by Fra Angelico with Jesus teaching his disciples in a place apart. It's a very, very beautiful painting, often used on the brochures for retreats and things like that.
Okay.
That's a little bit of the inspiration, although this actually is the profile of the panorama to my left, out out the window.
Oh, really? Oh, that's very cool. Okay.
So it doesn't this is it's made a little bit more rugged than it actually is, a little grimmer, but it is kind of like that.
Can I see your panorama shot? Would it show that? Or it's dark
Uh,
outside too.
no, because it's getting dark.
Yeah, yeah, that's not gonna work.
Nice to show you. Yeah, I paint this quite often actually, in different moods, the same way the French Impressionists would. But I really like what you got behind you. That's also very
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah. This is a quilt made by my current organist and music coordinator.
Wow.
So you have a connection with the organist emeritus with that book that's in your library. That's so cool. The hymnal. What's the name of the town where you are? It's
Isernia.
Isernia.
Isernia. Yeah, Isernia.
Isernia.
Yeah.
Um, so we have two Yorkies. One is Seabury, named after the first Episcopal bishop, but the
Right.
other one is Gubbio, named after the Wolf of Gubbio,
There you go.
which isn't too far from where you are. I guess I looked. It's like a 4 hour drive from where you are. The town.
Yeah, probably a bit more than that. It's beyond Assisi, just beyond Assisi.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's an interesting town.
You've been there?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'd love to visit
I
sometime.
think they have like 11 incorrupt saints in the churches there. 11.
Oh.
The incorruption seemed to work in that particular.
Yeah, it's something in the water there. Gubbio. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, maybe my I was gonna say maybe my Yorkie can attain some incorruptibility, but we'll see. Welcome everyone to the Christchurch Eureka Rector's Forum. I'm the Rector, Father Daniel London, and I am so honored to have as our guest Father Francis Vincent Tiso. Father Francis is a Catholic priest who previously served as the parochial vicar in Eureka from 1998 to 2000. 1998, I'm realizing, is also the year that Khenpo attained the rainbow body. He's a renowned scholar of Tibetan Buddhism and interreligious learning, and the author of Rainbow Body and Resurrection, Spiritual Attainment, The Dissolution of the Material Body, and the Case of Khenpo Ache, published by North Atlantic Books in Berkeley, where I used to live. And I actually had a friend who worked for North Atlantic Books. And this book was introduced to me by uh, one of our parishioners, Laura Rose. And I gotta say, the book is really extraordinary. It's kind of like nothing I've ever read, because it's part travelogue, it's part biography of Khenpo Ache, it's part introduction to Dzogchen, introduction to Syriac Christianity, and a lot more. And it's all presented from a lucid thinker yourself who recognizes your perspective as a Christian insider as well as an outsider when it comes to Buddhism. You talk about the emic and the etic perspectives. And uh, this was surprising when I started reading. Along with using the rainbow body idea to understand the resurrection in a new light, you're also using the resurrection to understand the development of the rainbow body concept in a new light. You say that the Christian doctrine of the resurrection merits consideration as a primary source for the notion of the rainbow body as it develops in the Dzogchen milieu of Imperial Tibet. Um, I want to thank you so much for your excellent sermon on the Transfiguration, which you talk about briefly as a kind of pre-resurrection manifestation of a kind of light body of Jesus Christ. For those who missed the sermon and those who want to hear it again, there will be a link included in the notes, because I want to use that sermon as a textual guide for our conversation. So I want to make sure those who are listening have access to that sermon. And using this as a guide, we may go on some wonderful detours into various parts of your research and your book and your spiritual journey. So thank you so much for being with us, taking the time. Father Francis coming to us from Italy, where there's a significant time difference. He is coming to us from the future. He's speaking to us from the future, probably in more ways than one. You talked about in your sermon the divine light as a reality that can be experienced and not just a metaphor. Many historical critical scholars of the Bible understand the resurrection of Christ as a metaphor or a sort of a symbolic way of talking about a faith experience. You were entrusted with this task of investigating the rainbow body as a phenomenon that may elucidate the resurrection as well as the transfiguration, and elucidate those as more than just metaphors. So I'd love for you to just tell us about your process and what kind of launched you on that process. I know Brother David Steindl-Rast kind of entrusted you to pursue that investigation and exploration. Tell us how that all began.
Yes, that allows me to tell you a little bit about Brother David. Brother David and I have been in a kind of master-disciple relationship since the late 1960s when I was an undergraduate at Cornell. And he brought the what he called at the time the Center for Spiritual Studies, which was a center that had no center. You know, it was a group of people engaged in a dialogue of spiritual experience coming from different traditions, who would gather and offer really conferences or workshops to fairly large numbers of young adults at the time. So I would imagine that at our very first experience of this kind, there were at least 200 Cornell undergraduates participating with Brother David, who was teaching both the Benedictine way and the way of Zen, because he had been practicing Zen meditation from the early 60s. He actually had formal permission to do that from the Vatican, the office that takes care of the interests of people in religious life. And so he had a formal permission to do that. And he did study under significant Japanese masters. And so he presented both Zen and Benedictine life. Along with him was Swami Satchidananda, the great master of integral yoga, very well known to people of that generation. Many people who went on to do great things in the area of spirituality and also scientific research on meditation were disciples, yoga adepts trained by Swami Satchidananda. Rabbi Joseph Gelberman from Eastern Europe also was part of the group. Dan Berrigan, who was on the chaplaincy, the ecumenical chaplaincy at Cornell, participated quite actively in these encounters. He was the noted peace activist, justice advocate among the Jesuits, and certainly was a great inspiration to us in those turbulent years of the Vietnam War and the struggle for racial justice. So these were very exciting people, and those events were pretty intense. So with Brother David, I was very, very, very captured, might say that it was a mind-boggling, horizon-breaking experience to meet this monk and to begin to practice Zen sitting under his guidance. And so we continued to engage in activities, especially at his monastery, with the other monks at Mount Savior Monastery just outside Elmira, New York, so much so that I came very close to joining that community. It was a very important part of my life. I wrote many of my term papers there. I spent many, many days in retreat there as often as I could get down there. It was really an important transformative experience for me. Later, I lived with Brother David in a small semi-eremitical community in Connecticut called the Benedictine Grange. That was from 1978 to 80. So by then I had finished my studies at Harvard Divinity School and was looking for a way to do ministry in a contemplative key. All right, so that was an opportunity to explore that and to do something of that kind. Brother David went on from there. I went on from there to work at Seabury Press in New York. You mentioned Bishop Seabury.
Yeah.
I actually worked there and was an acquisitions editor and a part of the administrative staff of the press. In those very turbulent years in New York, the press itself failed, but we learned so much about what was going to become the future of religious thought, religious thinking, theology over the next 20 years in America. A lot of the books that we young editors acquired, in which the sales force couldn't sell, later on became an important feature of the landscape of American religious evolution, such as Barry and Connolly's Manual of Spiritual Direction. It's the little blue book on spiritual direction that you'll find on practically everybody's shelf who does spiritual direction. And I'm very, very proud of that book because I was instrumental in building the bridge to the Jesuits, Barry and Connolly. So anyway, but I stayed in touch all this time with Brother David, who was continuing his evolution as a speaker and retreat leader. We gave a retreat on the rainbow body at Esalen Institute
Oh, wow.
long before the book came out.
Wow.
This was in the early 2000s, shortly after I left Eureka. But you know, it's very interesting that he was the one who was in dialogue with the Jesus Seminar.
Yeah.
All right, and especially Marcus Borg. And he was exploring with them, you know, the notion of the resurrection. And Brother David was convinced that there was more to the resurrection than just, you know, a kind of a spiritual, you know, excitement, a discovery, a breakthrough that was more, how shall we say, a faith experience, perhaps, rather than something of Jesus literally rising from the dead. But Brother David was convinced that there was more to it than that. There had to be more to it than that for many, many reasons, some of which, of course, anyone who's read John Chrysostom on the same point knows very well. John Chrysostom said, why would people go out and preach something that was only in their minds and even die for it? Right. You know, I mean, even the most dramatic and exciting mystical experience, even visionary experiences later on can leave a person feeling perhaps, you know, that was just in my mind, but something more than that stuck with the apostles and others, and something explosive happened in the history of humanity. So Brother David and I talked about this quite a lot, and we thought that perhaps the rainbow body phenomenon among the Tibetan Dzogchen practitioners might be a way to understand in a different cultural setting something of this way of transcending death, all right, way of transcending death and manifesting a truth that did, in fact, transcend the moment in which we leave this world. And that's why a lot of the book is dedicated to a reflection on death and dying and the meaning of the deaths of important people. All right. Now, it's not just the theological meaning, but a broad spectrum of meanings, including meanings that are perhaps distorted. All right. That death provokes a great deal of reflection. It is perhaps the greatest symbol provoking thought, you know, on the planet, maybe even more so than birth. You know, I mean, birth, certainly we celebrate birth and we're joyful at baptisms and all of that, but there's something about the death of an individual that really sticks with us. And especially when it's someone we loved very deeply, or when it's someone who was our spiritual teacher. So Brother David sent me off on this journey. Now, I have to admit that many times between 1999, when I began the research, all the way up to about 2014, I had many doubts. I had some doubts about whether this was not just a narrative, and I discussed that in the book. But more than that, I felt that it was almost impossible to write a book about this subject that would do justice to the expectations of people in religious studies, theology, Buddhist studies, and then to Buddhists, to
Right.
the people in the lineages, right?
Yeah.
As I did not want to, I was happy to challenge anybody in those categories, but I wasn't ready to do something that would offend the canons of, shall we say, uh, appropriate scholarship or whatever you want to call it in those different emic communities, right? And each one is a distinct community of discourse. You noted that the book is very unusual precisely because it speaks to different communities, and deliberately so.
Yeah.
So what I tried to do in the book at the end, when I had a couple of conversations with friends who said, no, you have to publish it. You really do have to publish it. It's difficult, but do it. Go ahead. Those conversations gave me the confidence to put it all together and to make what I call a kind of symphonic structure in
Mhm.
which there are different movements.
Yeah.
The themes are carried through and developed as in a symphony. And I think that a person reading the book will gain an aesthetic experience as well as an information experience.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it seems like it a magnum opus. I mean, it seems like you put your heart and soul and certainly your intellect into so much of it. Um, Thank you for sharing that story. I love also just the fact that you have a connection in Eureka as well as upstate New York. As I mentioned, my father went to Cornell. My mom lives in Ithaca. She grew up in Ithaca, and I go to Ithaca all the time. Um, and you were in Elmira. Um, and brother David Steindl Rost, I want to point out that Laura Rose, who inspired this conversation, said that she attended a series of lectures by him, and those changed her life from seeker to Christian 30 years ago and led to a prophetic dream experience. And I remember being so moved by just the simplicity of his teachings around gratefulness. And I share that with my congregation all the time. Um, if you want to experience instant happiness, just practice gratitude. Just start counting your blessings, the way David Steindl Rost invites us to. And I also say that the most frequent command in all of Scripture is basically praise the Lord, give thanks. And so David Steindl Rost has had an influence on my life as well. But was really excited to see how influential he was in this project.
Yeah, he's had an impact on so many people, and of course, I'm deeply grateful for that very special moment in 19 probably 69 or 70 when I actually met him. That was epical for me too.
I'm curious. I usually ask people in the Rector's Forum about this, and I'd love to hear from you. Just backing up a little bit more. You were born and raised in Eastchester, so close to
Eastchester, New York,
Nashville.
right?
Um, can you just give a little summary of your spiritual journey? What led you to the priesthood?
Ah, okay. That's a very, very long journey.
Okay.
I'll try to make it as short as possible. I mean, as a child, um, I can distinctly remember being fascinated by legends and myths, and would read quite a lot of, especially the Greek myths, but also Norse myths and some of the other aspects of even pre-Christian European culture. But as time went on, I used to take out books from the library, uh, mainly books of photographs. And of course, at that time, I'm sure my teachers, they knew this child was a little unusual, but they didn't really know how to put a label on it. But there were times in which I was allowed to do my own thing.
Hmm.
That it was they were very good about that, and I really bless God for that kindness and understanding. But really, what I was becoming was a little anthropologist.
Mm.
Okay, I was looking at these photos and kind of mentally living in the Andes, or in Africa, or in Southeast Asia, or the Himalayas, with people who were preserving these archaic ways of life. That absolutely fascinated me. And so I was really absorbing tremendous amounts of anthropological information from these books, the land and the people of kind of thing. And as time went on, I got quite interested in the sciences. And one of the key moments in my life, there were two things that coincided. A mother of a friend of mine was the advertising editor for a number of the leading theological journals in North America. Her name was Ruth Taylor. And Ruth Taylor said to me, you should start reading Teilhard de Chardin.
Oh, wow. Nice.
I was about 15 at the time, And so I had my mom one day went down to the Mount Vernon Library because there were no Teilhard books in the Eastchester Public Library.
Oh.
She went down to the Mount Vernon Public Library and brought back a stack of, of books by Teilhard de Chardin. And the lady at the checkout counter told my mom, "What's all this for?" She said, "It's for my crazy son." That's really dangerous stuff, I mean, so the people were aware that Teilhard was controversial. But I read through those books, and was absolutely turned on by this Jesuit thinker who was also an anthropologist,
Right.
was a paleontologist also, and who had a lot to say reflecting on experiences like, for example, working as an orderly and nurse during the First World War on the battlefield, things like that, and some of the other stuff that he wrote, which was not just the scientific or philosophical stuff, but his own personal experiences. The other thing that coincided with that was being chosen as one of 24 high school students for a summer program at the Boyce Thompson Institute for Plant Research in Yonkers, New York, now located at Cornell.
Okay.
But at that time, it was 2 or 3 bus routes away from our house in Eastchester, over on Upper Broadway in Yonkers. And so I would take the bus there every day and learn about some of the most amazing technology on the planet at that time. This is 1966. And it was one of those things where the Teilhard stuff and the science stuff coincided. And one of the exciting things for me at that time, which remains with me to this day, was the fact that in the afternoon, after our classes and laboratory work in the morning, we were assigned to be an apprentice scientist to one of the great professors in that institute. And I worked with a certain Dr. Wu, who was from Beijing, and his research was on the respiratory cycle in the cell. And so I had to inject a tiny amount of a radioactive acid into hundreds of string bean plants every afternoon.
Wow.
Okay. Now, this ritual of injecting the plants in this utterly silent and luminous greenhouse was absolutely fantastic, because I realized that the contemplative experiences that are described in some of Teilhard's writings, like, for example, his meditation on the lamp or on the Eucharistic wafer, this luminosity that fascinated him, was all around me in that greenhouse. All right. And had the coloration of these plants, and it was just an amazing thing for me, because I began to realize that you could be a contemplative doing science. You could be a person of prayer and sacred awareness in a setting that was so rigorously scientific. I mean, top of the line equipment and everything else. So that really stayed with it. In fact, I mentioned that experience to my Mind and Life colleagues, when we talk about, is this contemplative science or is this contemplation doing science?
Wow.
And I clearly felt that it was a contemplative act to do science. All right. A contemplative act to study nature in its intimate depths. And so that's, again, an important part of my life. Yeah. So I went on from there to Cornell. I started studying biochemistry. And for a couple of years, I actually did the biochemistry program, including some advanced first-year courses, which were fantastic. I hit a big snag, though. Now that I look back on it, and here we are, we're both members of the Reverend clergy, right? And we're and we're supposed to have a good conscience, and we're supposed to encourage a good conscience. I noticed that a lot of my friends finding it impossible, as I did, to memorize all the formulas in physics, in organic chemistry, in genetics, and everything else. Had all the answers written on their arms, on their slide rules. You remember slide rules? Maybe you don't.
No, I
Slide
don't.
rules were the calculators of the 1960s. I still have mine upstairs. And I had this crisis of conscience. Can I cheat on exams? All right.
Wow.
And I
Which
could.
all your classmates were doing.
Right. It was like the custom. Now I realize it was the custom. It was the way you did it.
Yeah.
But something about it seemed morally wrong to me at the time.
Yeah.
And so I refused to do it, which meant, of course, that I got, on the curve. I ended up on the lower end of the curve, right?
Wow.
So then I'm realizing, oh my God, if I keep going like that, I'll never get into grad school and I'll never be able to become a biochemist. At the same time, I had met Brother David. I had discovered a lot of things through friends that I'd met at Cornell, especially about history and European culture, which connected with my earlier fascination for mythology, poetry, history, and so on. And so I switched over into the history department. And it was as if my brain did a flip-flop.
Huh.
It was like I had the scientific brain and the scientific training, but there was a whole other thing that was, you might say, growing on its own. All right. And that really carried me forward as I began to also discover my priestly vocation, which really came to me quite early on when I got to Cornell, because I started to notice, people using LSD and other drugs. And some of them had asked me even to sit with them during these trips. All right. This is another reminiscence of those years. Yeah. And I realized that there was a great need for ministry. You see, there was a need to tend, to care for compassionately people who were exploring the boundaries of what was humanly possible.
Yeah.
All right. And then I actually had an inner experience meditating one evening in the chapel there. And this is a very interesting mystical experience, because not only because I had it, but because another friend of mine in the priesthood had it too, but a number of years later. All right. So this is, you might say, this is something that's out there, guys. It's basically what I saw, again, with my scientific and Teilhardian background. I saw, the whole universe evolving from its beginnings.
Wow.
And at the end of this long and magnificent symphonic evolution, then the inner voice says, "You are to be the priest of this, my creation." You see?
Wow.
Priest of all creation.
That's your ordination right there.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. And I turned around and I remember there was one of the Jesuit grad students was kneeling also in prayer in the chapel that time. And I turned around and said to him, I forgot his name. It'll come to me. I said, I think I got to be a priest. The New York accent. And, it was, but later on, years later, a very dear friend of mine, I won't give too many details because he is a fairly prominent person in ecumenical circles, but we did a retreat together. And I asked him, why did you become a priest? Because he left a very lucrative position. And he described the same exact experience, which must have taken place around 1984. So it's out there. This
is so powerful for me. There's just so many synchronicities. As I mentioned, my father went to Cornell. He was born in 1946, so a little older than you. He just passed away a few years ago. He has the word scientist written on his tombstone, that among other things, beloved father, husband, but he wanted to be a scientist. And he had an experience while studying chemistry at Cornell, as I was talking about, the Thurston Avenue Bridge, walking across. He was feeling suicidal. He was depressed, and was even thinking about gorging out, as people would do so often. And he had an experience where he looked at a piece of grass and said, "This blade of grass has more life than I do." And when he said that, he started seeing life just bursting forth from that blade of grass, and then he saw it everywhere, and he was just overwhelmed with life all around him, in the plants, um, in the other humans, and then in himself. And he wanted to go on. He wanted to explore what is the source of this, and he then found Teilhard de Chardin. And I love that he was such an influence on you, because I remember hearing that. I mean, you talked about how important and powerful the death of a spiritual master is. Didn't he say? Maybe this is apocryphal, but he said, if I turn out to be right, then may I die on Easter Sunday. And then he dies on Easter Sunday. And he says, we're not human beings having a spiritual experience, we're spiritual beings having a human experience. I mean, that just adds so much more layers of meaning for me to your work. And yeah, he had that experience in Cornell. It might have been, around the same time. He didn't become a priest, but he grew up Jewish, and then he went on a journey, studied under Sri Chinmoy, got very involved with meditative practices and yoga, and then eventually became a Christian, or he identified as a Messianic Jew. So that's powerful. I wish he was still alive to meet you, but that's the connections there are pretty astounding. So it's not the same exact experience, but maybe there's something going on. Like there's something in the water in Gubbio. There's something in the water in Ithaca, New York. Wow.
Yeah, because I wrote you also about a similar experience of my own,
Yeah.
in the environment of the gorge, full of ice and snow and water, and the opening up of light in all of that, very similar to what you are describing for your father with the blade of grass. So it is as if we can say that in upstate New York, in the southern tier, the Finger Lakes region, there's a lot of God out there.
Yeah, yeah. You're right. Wow. Oh man, I'm just kind of
I mean,
tripping
that's
out.
where Mormonism was born too,
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
the
Yeah.
golden plains and all.
Yeah, my dad would always say there are a lot of kind of crazy people from upstate New York. Well, and there's that legend of the Finger Lakes is where God placed his hand. Um, Boy, I'm just thinking about my own journey. Um, I grew up in the Bay Area and was heading down a path that was basically self-destructive. I was actually at a young age abusing um, these kind of psychotropic drugs, mostly marijuana. Um, and it wasn't until moving to Ithaca, my brother also was having some serious self-destructive issues with drugs and alcohol. We went to Ithaca, and I hated it, but I always look at that as kind of like this purgatory, because that was where I had this kind of dramatic change in my life, from kind of a young pothead to a really pious evangelist. My brother and I were, in Mountain View, California. We were at Rangsdorf Park buying marijuana from people there and smoking it and stealing. And then when we're in Ithaca, months later, we're on the streets downtown in the Commons passing out tracts telling people about Jesus. So I never really thought to hold Ithaca responsible for that, but there's something powerful about that. And now I'm thinking about how isn't that where the Dalai Lama has his North American seat, in Ithaca?
There is the Snowline Publications, and there is a monastery connected with that.
Okay.
I'm not sure if it's in Ithaca or in one of the nearby towns,
Yeah.
but
Okay.
yes, it's definitely an important place on the landscape of the Dalai Lama's presence in North America.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That always seems so random to me, but now it's starting to make some sense.
Yeah.
Wow. Um, Thank you for sharing that story of Teilhard de Chardin, the
But
Jesuit.
to even to continue with the thread of this, you'll notice that light as an experience is part of all of these stories.
Yeah.
And so when we talk about Rainbow Body, when Brother David entrusted me with this project, it was precisely because we had both explored the mysticism of light down through the years. And he felt that in addition to that, I had studied Tibetan Buddhism. I had the languages, I had my Sanskrit, I had my Tibetan, I had done Pali and so on, that I could do the scholarship as well. Because I did, after I finished with Seabury Press, I went on to do a doctorate at Columbia in Indo-Tibetan Buddhist studies. And so I was ready to go, you might say. But in that same period is when I was actually ordained to the priesthood. And that's a story in itself, because I had joined up after Cornell prematurely, and in those very turbulent years with the Paulist fathers, who was a Catholic religious order in the United States that did a lot of work on college campuses, among other things. But the community itself was really in a state of extreme flux, not to say chaos. And although we were a very large class, we were probably the last time in the Catholic Church in North America when a religious order had 26 novices in 1 year. Wow. All right, but we were quite a crew. We were a pretty lively crew, and almost everyone there, with just a few exceptions, had been to some other seminary or religious order and had been kicked out, but they had been picked up by the Paulists and were given a second chance. And it was very, very interesting, very lively, because the discussions were pretty intense, and a lot of things on social justice, were important to those times. But it was really not the environment where I could explore these more mystical things. And it really wasn't even that favorable to scholarship. There was a time of activism, all right, a Catholicism of activism, which I liked. I mean, that was fine for me. I had done it at Cornell, but it was not the right setting for me. So after 2 years, there was a real, almost violent parting of the ways. And then I went on to work for a year in Boston, and then I finished my Master of Divinity at Harvard Divinity, where they gave me a second chance. But having done it that way, it became impossible for any American diocese to accept me as a candidate for ordination. You see, the getting basically kicked out of religious order and then finishing at an ecumenical theological school was a formula, that was not acceptable to the American bishops. So sometime after my 2-year retreat experience with Brother David, and I was at Seabury, I was introduced to an Italian priest who was working at the United Nations named Ettore Di Filippo, who was working on a doctorate in the history of religions at Fordham University in the Bronx. And he was running an NGO that was an outreach to the elderly in different parts of the world, trying to get older people to be an integral part of the community, of their community life. So not to be warehoused, but to be provided with opportunities to be part of the community wherever possible. And so this particular organization needed an editor for its newsletter. So I signed on in that role. But my cousin, Bob Fastigi, who now teaches ecclesiology at the seminary in Detroit, and Wayne Teasdale, who you probably know about, the interspirituality movement, and several other people, John Borelli, who was my predecessor at the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops and is now the assistant to the president of Georgetown for interreligious affairs. It's several, Mary Evelyn Tucker, leader in Confucian thought and eco-theology, her husband, John Grimm. All these people were at Fordham at the time and were part of the circle of Father Ettore Di Filippo. Also, Tom Berry, the great, prophet of eco-theology. Was teaching. It was one of Ettore's teachers. So here you have this Italian priest working for the Vatican mission to the UN, but with all these amazing connections. And so we really formed kind of a group there. It wasn't official, but it was kind of this lively group of exchange of ideas. And Etere, I could tell Etere my story and my hope to become a priest. And when he was made a bishop in 1983, then I actually had a bishop who knew me on the inside,
Wow.
and not just my CV or Harvard or whatever, and who had also the power to ordain me to the priesthood. Because he
That's
was a
doing it.
diocesan bishop. He was not an auxiliary bishop, he's not an administrative bishop, but he was a bishop with a diocese. So that's how I ended up in Isernia.
Oh my
See,
gosh.
so what happened is that I started doing my doctorate, and then I came over here at the end of 1984 it was, and had that experience of the man of the shroud coming out
Yeah.
of the tabernacle in the body of light and telling me, if you want, you can come here.
Wow. Yeah.
You
Oh.
know?
Well,
So that was pretty amazing too.
so yeah, that's another question. You mentioned the shroud, and I appreciate you sharing that story with me. I'd love for you to share that here so that my parishioners can hear it. And one question that Laura Rose had was what's currently being done regarding research on the shroud.
Mhm.
That's again something my father was interested in, and uh, yeah, it, somebody who was trained in biblical spirituality. Uh, that was not something we would talk about, and and I think a lot of red flags go off. Shroud of Turin, no, nobody takes that seriously, and then you bring it up as as something that may be considered credible evidence of the resurrection, and then how it changes our whole perspective of at least how some of his disciples were understanding his death as sacrificial at that moment. So can you speak to that a little bit,
Sure,
and then
sure. And
and
of course,
also your vision? Go
that
ahead.
was one of the primary motivations for Brother David wishing to go farther with Marcus Borg. Because David was convinced of the authenticity of the shroud because he had read the stuff online that is in abundance. The research that has been done using all kinds of metrics that I've only recently come into use. All right, so when the carbon-14 dating information came out, so many people really expressed considerable doubt that however they did that experiment, there had to have been a flaw.
Mm,
And then during the course of the 80s and 90s, the flaws came out. That the part of the cloth that was studied and came up with a 13th century date was the part of the cloth that was most frequently handled by people when they would display the relic. Okay, so that it contained the sweat and the natural oils from people's palms, embedded into the fabric. All right, and then the bacteria that also would create a certain kind of plaque on the fibers at those points. That was the cloth that was used. All right, that was the part of the cloth that was tested, because obviously being on the edge, it wouldn't damage the image. Right. All right, so you fix one thing, you wreck another. And but meanwhile, then they do this amazing research with optics, and they show, well, all right, this is a cloth lying on somebody's face, right? So how would it be that you'd get this image of a face, right? Because it would be distorted. And then they worked on the distortion principle of contact with the cloth and came up with a lot of really remarkable information, which we could go on all afternoon talking about. The idea that they could see, for example, the coins on the eyes, that there were silhouettes of flowers on the chest, that the strand of hair that an Orthodox Jew would allow to grow is there.
wow.
There's a lot of incredible details. The wounds, of course, the wounds of the crown of thorns, the wounds of the hands and the feet. They're in the wrist. They're not in the palm of the hand. They're in the wrist, which is anatomically more believable. the wound in the side, the exact form of the whip ends that were used, the little metal pieces that were tied onto the end of the leather whips that were used for the flagellation, that you can see the form, the silhouette of those little dumbbell-shaped pieces of metal on the back of Christ and across his legs. There are so many things that are visible on the shroud. Many things were visible already in the original photographs from 1898. But once you started doing it with, image enhancement technology, you got, almost a world of information there. But the thing that really hits us theologically is when we start talking about the actual cloth that was used. It was not the usual cloth that would have been used for a shroud. It's this herringbone weave linen of very high quality, very expensive, that would have only been used for either royal garb or, above all, temple use, for the vestments of the priests and for cloths placed on the sacred altars in the temple in Jerusalem. Right now, who would have had access to that kind of material? Well, we have these two figures, Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, who are described as the people who brought Jesus's body down from the cross. All right, so the great paintings of the deposition always have Mary of Magdalene, John, the Blessed Mother, and then these two men who were distinguished members of the Sanhedrin, all right, bringing down the body from the cross. Now, they come up with this very long stretch of cloth, it's double the length, more than double the length of a human body, and they place Jesus's body in it and fold it over his head. So there's a front and back, all right, with the loose end down at the feet. And then he's placed on the slab in this tomb, okay? But the fact that they use that cloth already suggests that, at least to these two distinguished, actually highly trained rabbinic leaders, right, they are saying this death is no ordinary death. This death is a sacrifice, a prophetic sign in the form of a sacrifice that has something to do with the cleansing of the whole world, All right, so that you remember in John's gospel, they quote Caiaphas as saying one man should die for the people, right? And that's identified as prophetic.
Yeah.
But already within hours of the crucifixion itself, we have two distinguished rabbis saying this is a death to end all deaths, all right, to end sin, it is an atonement death, okay? And this is incredible because, most people would say, this idea of the atonement, that Jesus' death was a sacrifice atoning for our sins, is a theological idea that comes in later as Christians read the prophetic texts, especially in Isaiah, that refer to the suffering servant. But here, these guys are getting it while Jesus is still dying on the cross. They understood.
Wow.
Now, from the point of view, even from we're talking about, if we're talking about spiritual experiences, mystical experiences, so on and so forth, could it be that having been with Jesus and having been his, you might say, inner circle secret disciples, not the 12, but this sort of esoteric group that was very passionately attached to Jesus, could it be that they already knew as much as Peter, James, and John about the light body of Jesus? They already knew that Jesus was much more than a prophet, a preacher, a holy man, a healer. That his role in the world was something beyond the ordinary. And so they were, in a certain sense, ready for what was going to happen. And that maybe, just as, this just occurred to me now that we're talking about it, but how many people have been deeply transformed and converted simply by meditating on the Passion of Christ?
Yeah, yes.
When you realize the degree of love that is present in that, well, there they are at the real thing.
Yes.
How could they not be moved?
Yeah. Well, and that's actually, that perspective really supports some of the work I've been doing with the anthropologist um, Rene Girard.
Ah, there you go. Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
my dissertation's all about the the fourth gospel
Uh,
from a Girardian perspective, the sacrifice to end all sacrifices.
mhm.
Um, and actually, you mentioned that Caiaphas, it is better for one person to die than for the whole nation to be destroyed. I mean, that's basically Girard mimetic theory summed up in one sentence. And I remember the first academic paper I presented was on that, and it was at Iona College
Oh,
near where you
wow.
grew up. Yeah, in New Rochelle. But something else you mentioned about the shroud that I remember you mentioning in a video, how people who claim it's a forgery, you say, well, as somebody who studies art and as an artist yourself, there's no style to it,
Yeah.
um, and the idea of somebody forging that sounds like that would be almost as big of a miracle as the resurrection, right? Because like, how could somebody create something like that, especially even around the 13th century? So
Well, even looking at the tree behind you, you know,
yeah,
I mean, yeah, we know it's a tree because our mind, having had experiences of perceiving trees, knows that that's a picture of a tree, but it's clearly a work of art.
right.
All right. It's enhanced in many ways with color and texture and so forth. All right. Where you look at the shroud, there is no enhancement. There is no style. There's no period. You couldn't say, oh, this is, the Gothic Christ or the Byzantine Christ. In fact, the image of Christ on the shroud was known well enough in Byzantium that it did influence icons and even coins. We do know that that is part of the history of the shroud and its peregrinations in the Middle East and in Byzantium before it came to Europe. But the fact of the matter is that not only is it not a work of art, but it has encoded in it uh, optical phenomena that no artist, not even the greatest artist in history, not even Leonardo, would have been able to reproduce on a cloth. And of course, if you look at on our microscope at the fibrils of the cloth, the image itself is burned into the uppermost fibrils of the woven linen cloth, which is, some people have tried to warm up an iron statue and then apply a linen cloth to it to try to get that effect. You don't get that effect. The closest that people have gotten is with some kind of a laser that will just burn the upper fibrils. But then lasers are what? Concentrated light. And so you're back to step one. How did this light come out of the entire body of a presumably dead human being? All right.
Yeah. So how does I mean, you address this, and I appreciate how you're hesitant to draw any conclusions, but I just want to kind of explore your imagination based on your in-depth research on Khenpo Ache, um, who attains the rainbow body. There are rainbows all over. There's music people are hearing, and his body, it's this dissolution of a body. Not even fingernails left over, although that's the case in some dissolutions. Um, and I remember you in the book you kept looking. Is there some, there's that yellow cloth, but is there some image? There's nothing quite like the Shroud of Turin. So I guess I'm wondering, based on your research of the rainbow body, what do you imagine happens in that tomb of Jesus that creates the Shroud of Turin, and then has him then walk around and in this kind of spiritual body, what Paul calls the spiritual body?
Yeah, one of the differences between the rainbow body and the shroud is precisely the image. All right.
Yeah, right.
So the people who have, and I've interviewed some of them. I interviewed Emmanuel Marinelli, for example, who was one of the leading researchers on this. I read the book "The Burst of Conscious Light" by Barry Schwartz, who is he doesn't accept it as a religious, shall we say, a cause of religious faith, but he does accept it as truly the burial cloth of Jesus, and that Jesus had this extraordinary ability. he tries to explain it in terms of basically a very high degree of ethical and spiritual development in the case of Jesus. Okay. Now let's think about that for a moment in the light of other research that we have now, thanks to neuroscience and other studies of the structure of the human cell. There is something called biophotons.
Oh, right, biophotons, yeah.
Okay. So each cell, as part of that cycle that I was studying back with Dr. Wu at the Boyce Thompson Institute, the cycle of respiration, assimilation, and so on that goes on inside the cell is directed, we usually say, by the DNA in the nucleus. All right. But then we have, and we all become experts in mRNA, thanks to the vaccines, right?
Right.
So from the DNA, the mRNA goes out into the cell nearby the mitochondria and directs the process of generating proteins. Now, there is another factor in all of this. There is a pulsation of light energy that comes out of the nucleus that helps guide this process, that helps to energize this process. And these little tiny bits of light are called photons, biophotons. And they have been known since the 1920s. This is not something that was just recently discovered. And even there are therapeutic procedures that have been devised in some European laboratories and clinics for using biophotons to restore the biological equilibrium of a human being who has been ill. All right. Now, in 1997, somebody did a really interesting experiment, which is exactly the experiment that I said back in 1918 ought to be done. It had been done, a few years previously. I only found out about it afterwards. It was picked up. So we're talking, like 18, 20, 20 years later by a French news service. Basically, what was done was people who were practicing the Sufi Muslim remembrance of God practice, the zikr practice of reciting the names of God rhythmically in a deep state of contemplative awareness. All right, these people were tested for their biophoton output. Now, the output was extraordinary, like hundreds of thousands of times higher than normal. Not just like 1%. It was gigantic, of people just doing the names of God and adoring God, in that state of awareness. Nobody followed up on this, and it's an experiment that definitely needs controls, follow-up, a full-fledged lab, and the whole story. Nevertheless, it does suggest to us that the body in a state of contemplative awareness, praising God, adoring God, engaged in contemplative prayer, actually heightens a biological process that goes on in each and every one of our cells. All right. Now, flash our way back to in time travel to Jesus himself, who has already manifested the body of light to his disciples on the Mount of the Transfiguration. Right. He knew how to turn on the light bulb. He knew this from his own inner experience. At the time of his death, he who was in touch, and of course, by our faith, we know he's the Logos of God. He's the one through whom all things were made. Why is he the one through whom all things were made? Because he knew how it all works, even better than the angels, because the angels in classic angelology are on that side of the spiritual creation that can see the way things are made. Right? They admire God's work. But here we have the one who did the work, the one who is a demiurgos, right? The one who is the word, the Sophia of God, who has created this universe. And so he turns on the light bulb of primordial energy, and rises from the dead and leaves his image on the shroud. Okay, so the shroud confesses atonement, and it confesses the identity of Christ as the incarnate Logos. All right.
Wow.
It's powerful.
So
Think,
amazing.
granted, you know how we poets and theologians are. We can overstep our bounds, but we're reflecting also as men of faith.
Yeah.
I mean, why would anyone believe that? And it's said at least 4 times in the New Testament that Jesus is the one through whom all things were made. All right. Why would early Christians say that off the top of their heads? You know, it's so contrary to, certainly a Jewish ethos to say that of a human being. Right.
Yeah. Well, and it makes me, I've been so drawn to Jewish mysticism. I have Jewish background through my father's side, and
Right.
I love Gershom Scholem's attempt to understand the Jewish mysticism of Jesus' day, the Merkabah mysticism. I just wonder, even N.T. Wright thinks that Paul was practicing a form of Merkabah mysticism on his road to Damascus when he's blinded by this experience of light. I just can't help but wonder what practices. I mean, obviously he's the Word made flesh. He is the Logos. Uh, but what practices was Christ engaged in? Contemplative practices that we can then experience, a form of Merkabah mysticism. Obviously, we know he would stay up all night praying. He would go off alone, 40 days in the desert. But and I wonder, you talk about the Syriac tradition. I wonder if there's something we can trace in terms of contemplative practices, or maybe the Hesychast tradition. What do you think Jesus was doing, or did it just he already knew it so he could just turn it on and off, or was he also kind of cultivating it? Because as Luke says, he still grew in wisdom and strength. Were there certain things he was doing? I mean, obviously it's conjecture, but what would you imagine he was practicing?
What is the citation in Scripture where Jesus tells his disciples, that which was said in secret should be proclaimed from the housetops?
Yes, yes.
I'm not sure, is that Luke or Matthew? I love that line because it seems to suggest that Jesus was aware of a Jewish mystical tradition that was secret, that was prohibited. You were not supposed to proclaim that from the housetops. That was,
Ah,
and as you know, even to this day, the Kabbalah is for those who are over 40, and
right.
had there are certain criteria that must be met before you engage in Kabbalah mysticism. So Jesus was telling his disciples, we are now moving into a end of an era and beginning of another era. And
Yeah.
so in this era, we must proclaim things that were previously held secret. All right. And this is in first chapter of Ephesians too, that wonderful cosmic hymn, which seems to suggest that from all eternity, it was God's intention to unite us with Christ in a loving relationship that is eternal. Whereas God's eternal love was going to be shared with all of us, right? That hymn could be expounded for days, the stuff that's in there, and so what it's proclaiming is that these secrets, which, and now we go back to my sermon, right? My homily, right? Behind the veil of the 4 colors of the elements, right? Which is the veil between the material creation that we encounter with our material senses and our embodied consciousness. Then behind the veil is the spiritual creation that is not visible with the eyes, but is visible to the eyes of the spirit of the heart, right? Of the nous, as Evagrius would say, right? So to go through the veil is to enact with the high priest the ritual of Yom Kippur,
Mm.
right? The atonement, but now atonement, the absolute atonement, all right? And also being back there with the high priest, who is now Jesus, all right? You're back there with Jesus, who is showing you how he made everything, how
Oh.
he created everything. I had to cut out the paragraph on Dante because it was making the homily too long. But Dante Alighieri in the Paradiso is basically describing going beyond the veil, right, and seeing how the universe works, the
Yeah.
mechanisms, and
Well,
going all the way up to the Trinity, which is rainbow light, by the way, in the Divine Comedy, the three circular rainbows in Canto 33. So, I'll tell you another really neat thing I wanted to bring
Yeah.
into the homily.
Yeah.
There's a church, it's Benedictine nuns. The church is from the 13th century, just outside of Milano. And on the ceiling, from the entryway to the altar, there are a number of, I think they're frescoes. And they start with simple forms, and finally they get to the risen Christ surrounded by rainbow light, a circle of rainbow light.
Wow.
Right? But in each of the stages going up there, you gain more access to more colors. All right. So that the elements are filling out in their luminous quality. All right. So that as you move through spiritual transformation, you perceive greater and greater color and less matter. It's
Wow.
absolutely fantastic. So this is not unknown. People represented this experience in works of art. So when we talk about it, it's because getting back to the theme of experience, people had the experience, and then we trace the experience through works of art. And at the same time, now we have laboratory equipment that helps us a little bit and opens up our minds and our horizons. All right.
Mm.
This is why this whole area of research is so exciting, because as you see in the book, we're uniting the anthropology, the religious anthropology of people, whether they are the Tibetan people, the people of ancient Palestine, the monastic Christians of the Syriac tradition in Central Asia, or even our own Western European Middle Ages, right? We're bringing together those anthropologies of cultural units that were in fact in contact with one another, right? And then we try to explore this, maybe asking questions as scientists, as anthropologists, as theologians, and as people on the journey ourselves,
Yeah.
right? Because this is contemplation doing research, right?
Right.
It's not just
Right.
contemplative research, but it's contemplation doing research, all right? And that's why we also apply disciplines to it, that the act of applying the discipline is kind of the ritual container within which research is done, but then that which receives as a gift the fruits of research is the inner life, you see.
Yeah. Yeah. Boy.
Not too many people talk like that, but we should start talking like that. We
Yeah.
definitely should. Francisco Varela and his colleagues, back in the late 80s, early 90s, started talking that way. They are the great pioneers in neuroscience and the study of meditation, that study that made subjective experience accessible to scientific investigation. So by now, it's very interesting. There's a new edition of his great book, The Embodied Mind, with critical essays by some of the original authors who are still alive. Unfortunately, Francisco passed away. And they say, this has become almost now a commonplace in some circles, but not in all circles, all right, to
Yeah.
talk this way. But we can now start talking this way, thank God.
Yeah. But do you feel like you conclude with Thomas Merton's reflections on the self as a process and sort of this collapse of the objective and the subjective? It seems like maybe he was starting to talk this way.
Yes.
Yeah.
And his great poem, Hagia Sophia,
Yeah.
which really allows us to understand in a poetic way the way Merton's mind really worked when it was, really free to explore both tradition and horizon possibilities,
Right.
is a great thing, because of course Sophia is the word, is the logos, as the fathers made quite clear. Athanasius is
Yeah.
extremely clear that the reason why the logos is of one substance with the Father is because that is the uncreated Sophia.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
I really appreciated that you, in your sermon, clarified the fact that Paul was not demoting God's covenant with Israel in that particular reading, while also not denying that that does seem to be what the author of Hebrews does. it's sort of ironic that the book of Hebrews seems to be the most supersessionist of all the New Testament writings.
Right.
But I was wondering, the question I wrote was, in your interreligious work, if you partnered and or conversed in depth with Jewish leaders and rabbis, and in doing so, have you come across any spiritual manifestations akin to the rainbow body within rabbinic Judaism or Jewish mystical traditions? Beyond
So far, not that.
Yeah.
But the guys that we're talking, I mean, especially the men, the women are more on the borderline between psychology and Judaism, in that particular orientation. But three of the men who are rabbis and are about, I would say, roughly about my age, each of them has come through an experience of Judaism that includes mystical training. And you can tell by the way they encounter the gospel that they are on a certain level,
Yeah.
in their awareness. And I would say that's Aidan Steinsaltz, who is one of the greatest Talmudists alive. If he's still alive, I hope he's still alive. He may be, among Jews living today, the one who would best understand what we're talking about here at the highest level.
Wow.
I've seen him speak and answer questions in such a way that anyone in the room would have understood the correct answer in his or her own way.
Wow.
That kind of stuff. Amazing.
Aiden
Amazing.
Steinsaltz. I just wanted to share this with you because right after writing this question, I was reading a book. Levi Yitzhak of Berdichev. He's one of the tzaddik, one of the Hasidic masters of Ukraine, which is in the news so much right now. He writes this, and I'll be happy to send this to you, but I just thought, wow, this is incredible. He's talking about his experience of being in prayer with his master, who is the Magid of Mezrich. And he says, Magid, turned slowly from the wall in front of which he had been praying, and I beheld his face. I beheld upon his face such light and majesty as the glory of a heavenly rainbow. Fear and trembling fell upon me. I stumbled back. Arms supported me lest I fall. But those who held me did not know the reason. And then it went away. And then he said, only at the time of my master's death did I see such splendor as this again. And it was from that light and splendor and majesty which shone from his face that I was able to truly understand his teachings. So that was like 18th century tzaddik. I thought, wow, okay, there's an example of a Hasidic master seeming to attain a rainbow body, which happens during his lifetime, like the Transfiguration, and then during his death as well.
That's fantastic. I had not seen that passage. Yeah. Very interesting in my explorations of tzaddiks.
Yeah,
that's great. But and it does not surprise me, considering the other things that we have been discussing today.
You talk about in your book, you were known as the Jesus Lama.
Oh yeah.
You would perform this puja, which is the Eucharist, and obviously there's different theological understandings among Anglicans and among Roman Catholics, but I'm so curious about how the rainbow body has shed new light on your understanding, and even how the Shroud of Turin has shed new light on your understanding of what goes on, that mystery of transubstantiation, what's happening in the Eucharist. It's always in the back of my mind now when I'm celebrating, because also we have as I look out towards the congregation, we have a beautiful rainbow stained glass window that's on the other side of the wall, and so I'm just constantly thinking of rainbow body. And this was the ritual that Jesus gave us. Maybe that's sort of one of the contemplative disciplines. How does this shed new light for you on communion, on Mass, on transubstantiation?
I think one of the primary themes in my own hope to one day be ordained to the priesthood, from the time I was 8 years old until I was 38, when I was finally ordained, was the idea of being so close to Christ that when I would celebrate the Eucharist, I would be Eucharist. And in fact, in the vows that are made by a deacon at ordination, it does say to live a Eucharistic life,
Mm.
to live a Eucharistic life.
Wow.
Then when we meditate, I think maybe in some Anglican churches they may do this, but certainly in Roman Catholicism it's become extremely popular, the idea of Eucharistic adoration.
Yeah.
What, we look at the consecrated Eucharistic wafer and contemplate the mystery of that presence. The beauty of this contemplation is that it is formless, essentially formless. You have this fragile mixture of water and flour, nothing else.
Mm.
As fragile, as subtle, as translucent as can be, something that will not last very long. All right. And you're contemplating the entire blueprint of the universe, the experience of 1968, right in the chapel. The whole universe is present there.
Yeah.
And personally present, the person who is the mastermind, all right, of all creation. You contemplate that and then let go of the conceptual thoughts and just are with him as he reveals, as he discloses the immensity of his love there. Okay. All right. And so that our Eucharistic so then when we celebrate the Eucharist, we're aware that the community is gathered, and now for an action, all right, Christ himself makes himself present. So one of the things, even as a priest, when I am celebrating the Eucharist, I am aware of the presence of the congregation, and I'm aware of the presence of God. Do we know who we're talking to when we say those words? Right? I ask myself this question as an examination of conscience before I go out there to celebrate. Who are you going to be talking to? Are you ready to address that one? My Jewish friends in Israel were dialoguing on the Gospel of Luke. Do not even use the word Adonai to talk about that one. They use the word Hashem.
Right, the name, yeah.
Exactly. So this reverence for the one to whom we are speaking, and the one who, on his initiative, chooses to be with us because we pronounce those words. This is very powerful.
Yeah, it is.
And then we understand what it means, fear of God and reverence, those gifts of the Spirit. I think sometimes we are so awed by this that we rush through the words, or we're thinking about something else, or we are tempted to dislocate, to decathect, because it's too much. Yeah. But we really, through contemplative prayer, through reflection, and through the formless and the wordless kinds of prayer, we get ready for what needs to be done in that moment, which is, and we learned this from our Byzantine friends who call it, he served Eucharist. That is, the priest is serving the people through the presentation of the Eucharistic consecration, right? So I am at the service of my people when I perform the rite of a priest. But in performing the rite of a priest, I am speaking to Hashem, right? And Hashem is sending his son, in our midst. And this is extraordinary. This is really this is the cosmic meaning of the Mass. Yeah. And that's why it's so important. You did raise the question of the relationship between Eucharist and rainbow body. If we go with our high priest, the great high priest, Jesus Christ, through the veil, into the spiritual creation, once again with him, he will elevate us even beyond that, into the intimate communion with the Holy Trinity, the perichoresis, the dance of the Trinity, which is beyond words and forms. So, this is very high spirituality, but it's what God is inviting us all there. It's not just the priest. The priest is at the service of this.
So I guess one question that emerges for me, I imagine this is a question that emerges for a lot of people. How do we attain that not necessarily the rainbow body, but that same. I mean, I feel like as you were talking, something was stirring. I was like, oh, maybe those are my biophotons stirring. And I also just appreciate the fact that you're coming to me through light, through Zoom.
In
Um,
light, yeah.
yeah, but I'm like, I wonder, like, is the Eucharist, is that a way to to regularly share Eucharist for us to be uh, cultivating ways to turn on the biophotons, or maybe those are just going to be turned on for us, because obviously this rainbow body phenomenon happens, relatively often, but to people who've spent their whole lives in contemplative disciplines, except for, I mean, what was it, like 60 years you have to
Right.
contemplate.
But
Jesus was able to do it in less than that. But I love the idea that through Christ that's been made open to so many more. So I guess the question is, how can we how can we hope that we can attain that and experience that that light body?
the beauty of the Eucharist is that since it touches every single person, and if you love the people who are coming to receive, you see their spirit, uh, reaching out invisibly to receive what is being given. This is what's going on.
Hmm.
That through faith, they are taking into their life stream the power of the one who is the source of all things. All right, who does not, who's not afraid of them, who is
Yeah.
not repelled by them,
Yeah.
who does not hate them,
Hmm.
who has no intention of condemning them, but really wants to love them so that they can come to the fullness of life. All right, so this is what we are responsible for. We are at the service of that. It is up to Hashem, all right, to decide how each person will be made sanctified. All right, but certainly the things that we're discovering through the shroud, through things like biophotons and some other research that has been done on things like gamma rays and so forth, there are some measurable criteria, but they do not exhaust, what is actually going on. All right, neither in us as Christian people of faith, nor in the yogis who've done 60,000 hours of meditation. Right, the Dan Goleman and Richie Davidson wrote a book called Altered Traits. All right, what are they saying? There are permanent changes in the lives of people who practice. Right,
Yeah. Yeah.
but that practice cannot be reduced to only one particular practice, like hesychasm, saying the Jesus prayer, or like shamatha vipassana meditation or something like that. And in fact, when we actually get to know yogis, we go to the Himalayas, we go to India and interview people. They're doing many different kinds of practices. Some of them engage the body, the mind, the voice, many different practices, because all of these different practices are an expression of consciousness. The whole body is conscious, not just the brain. All right. And it's not just one thing. This is why, if you did music or singing or dancing or works of art, you would be altering the brain in similar ways. And especially if you knew by a direct experience that it was a mystical thing, when you put that uh, paint on the canvas, you would know what you're doing.
Yeah.
That's an extension of your spirit. All right. One of the reasons why I think we're so fascinated by beautiful works of art, like the one behind you, the fascination is almost as if our spirit is being invited outward toward those forms and those colors, because we know that those luminous colors, like very much that picture behind you, suggests an invitation to go beyond the veil,
Oh, yeah. Right.
to
Mm.
go to the source of color, the source of light, the source of energy in our own bodies. So ordinary people who make beautiful things, even if it happens to be, as I like to tell my people around here, un piatto di minestra, right? A plate of good soup,
Nice.
comes out so beautiful and so tasty and so wonderful. right? That beautiful work of art already awakens not only gastric juices, all right, but a new level of gratefulness and consciousness. All
Wow.
right, you see.
Wow. Father Francis, thank you for this plate of delicious soup. Seriously, biophotons stirring. If I can, if I
Yeah.
don't be presumptuous, but boy, it was when you're talking, I'm like, wow, this is so powerful.
I'm grateful for your help because we are supporting many people in severe difficulty.
Absolutely.
So,
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
so every little bit helps. All right, it's
Of course, we are honored. When you've been helping us, you've shed so much light and wisdom, and I'm excited to hear how my congregation responds. And again, I want to thank Laura Rose for introducing me to you and your work, and just honor the fact that your book, I think, played a significant role in what the doctors call miraculous uh, healing of after a cancer surgery. So your book was with her when I visited her in the hospital.
fantastic.
So
Yeah.
it is spreading out its healing light all over the world, and including in Eureka where you once served. And hope you get to visit here again sometime. And if so, we have guest rooms here. This is called the Transfiguration House because there were Anglican nuns here, Sisters of the Transfiguration. Their main house is in Glendale, Ohio, but this is now the rectory. But you have a place to stay here if you ever come by.
Fantastic. I look forward to it very much. Thank you. Many blessings to you and all your people, and
God
all the
bless
people
you.
in Eureka whom I love very dearly. That was 2 years, but it was really more than 2 years.
It sounds like it, yeah. And I'm glad you already have one book from Eureka in your library, and I hope to send you at least a couple more.
Cool.
God
All right.
bless
Thanks.
you, and good night. Thank you so much, my friend.